First story, the case of the house at the end of the road. I've been a cop in Birchfield, Maine, for almost 25 years now. It's a small town, quiet, unassuming. The kind of place where people know each other, where nothing really happens except the occasional drunk causing trouble or a couple of kids pulling pranks. But sometimes, something happens that shakes you to your core. That night was one of those times. It was early November, cold enough that frost had started to cover the roads. I was finishing up my shift when a call came through the radio. Dispatch said some of the locals were complaining about strange noises coming from the old Brenner house, down at the end of Foster Road. Gritting my teeth, I almost dismissed it. The Brenner house had been abandoned for as long as I could remember. A relic from the past. Boarded up windows, peeling paint, and a sagging roof. Teenagers dared each other to break in, and rumors swirled about hauntings, but nothing serious ever came of it. Still, the reports were consistent. Screaming, flickering lights. Something in my gut told me I should check it out, so I grabbed my coat, told dispatch I was heading over, and drove out. Foster Road is a long, narrow strip of asphalt that winds through dense woods on the outskirts of town. The trees stand like sentinels, dark and silent, their branches reaching over the road like skeletal arms. The Brenner house sits at the very end, surrounded by nothing but woods. As I pulled up, I killed the engine and stepped out of the cruiser, my breath visible in the cold air. The house loomed ahead of me, as dark and foreboding as the rumors suggested. Even though there were no lights on, I could swear I saw movement in the windows, shadows flickering like someone walking by with a lantern. I chalked it up to my mind playing tricks. I stood there for a moment, listening. At first, all I heard was the wind rustling through the trees. Then faintly came the sound. A low moan, almost too quiet to catch. Then a scream, sharp and desperate, cutting through the stillness. Every hair on my neck stood on end. My training kicked in, and I reached for my flashlight and pistol, pushing the old iron gate open with a groan that echoed into the night. The front porch creaked under my weight as I stepped up, and the front door swung open with ease, too easily for a house that had been abandoned for decades. Inside, the air was thick, almost oppressive, carrying a musty, damp smell. I shone my light around, revealing dust-covered furniture, cobwebs clinging to every corner. The house was dead, yet there was something off. It was like I wasn't alone, like eyes were on me, watching. I moved deeper into the house, calling out, "Police! If anyone's here, show yourself." No response. Then, from upstairs, I heard the distinct sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate. They weren't hurried like a scared intruder trying to hide. They were measured like someone or something was waiting for me. I took the stairs, each step creaking under my boots. The hallway at the top was narrow, lined with faded portraits of people I didn't recognize. Probably the Brenner family. Their eyes seemed to follow me as I made my way to the source of the noise. At the end of the hall was a door, slightly ajar. The light in the room beyond was flickering, like a dying bulb trying to stay lit. I nudged the door open with the barrel of my gun, and what I saw chilled me to the bone. The room was empty, save for an old rocking chair in the corner. But the chair was moving, rocking slowly back and forth, as if someone had just been sitting there. The light above continued to flicker, casting erratic shadows on the walls. I stepped inside, and the door slammed shut behind me. I whirled around, yanking on the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Then the whispers began. Soft at first, almost like the wind, but growing louder, more insistent. They came from all around, voices I couldn't place, all speaking at once. Some were angry, others were pleading, but I couldn't make out the words. My flashlight flickered, the beam growing weak, as if the house itself was draining the energy from it. I turned back toward the room, and that's when I saw the door in the floor. A trapdoor partially hidden beneath a threadbare rug. The whispers grew louder, urging me to open it. I don't know why I did it. Maybe I was in shock, Or maybe the house was already working its way into my mind. I pulled the door open, revealing a set of stairs leading down into the dark. The air that rushed up from below was damp and cold, carrying the scent of decay. Against every instinct, I descended. At the bottom, the basement was larger than I expected, filled with old, rotting furniture and personal items. Photos, clothes, toys, belongings of the families who had lived here long ago. The walls were lined with shelves, each one holding relics from the house's past. And in the center of the room was a large, ornate mirror, its surface covered in dust. I approached the mirror, wiping away the grime, and what I saw in the reflection nearly made me drop my flashlight. It wasn't me staring back. It was me, but younger, in my old uniform. My heart pounded as I recognized the moment, the day I botched that case. The one I never told anyone about. The one that haunted me every night since. I had arrived too late, and a girl had died because of my mistake. I had never forgiven myself. But as I watched, the younger version of me in the reflection wasn't just a memory. He was moving, reliving that horrible night, his face twisted in regret, fear. And then he looked at me, directly at me, as if he could see me through the mirror. I stumbled back, tripping over something on the floor. As I hit the ground, the whispers became screams, angry, accusing. The room spun, and I scrambled to my feet, desperate to get out. But the basement was changing, the walls closing in, warping like the house itself was alive. I ran for the stairs, but the trapdoor slammed shut above me. I banged on it, screaming for help, but deep down, I knew no one was coming. And then, in the corner of my eye, I saw him again, the younger me, standing in the shadows, watching, waiting. I'm still here, trapped in this house. The radio crackles occasionally, voices coming through, but no one ever hears me. No one ever finds me, because the truth is, I never left. Second story, The Call of the Forest Man. I've been a cop for 15 years in a quiet town nestled in the forests of the Pacific Northwest. Our usual calls involve lost hikers, the occasional drunk driver, and the rare case of vandalism. Nothing serious, nothing dangerous. That all changed last fall, during what should have been a routine patrol in the woods. My partner, Dan, and I were called to check out a report of strange sounds coming from a section of the forest that borders the Cascade Mountains. The caller claimed they heard distant voices, too far to make out but unsettling enough to report. We didn't think much of it. Wild animals can make odd sounds at night, but we figured we'd better check it out. The drive out to the forest was quiet, the sky overcast as the sun dipped below the horizon. We parked the cruiser at the edge of the trailhead and radioed in our location before starting our walk into the woods. The air was crisp, the smell of damp earth thick around us. Everything seemed normal at first, just the crunch of leaves under our boots and the occasional rustle of wildlife in the bushes. But as we got deeper, that sense of normalcy started to slip away. The forest seemed too quiet. No birds, no wind, just nothing. The kind of silence that presses down on you, making you feel like something is watching. Dan noticed it too, casting nervous glances around us, but neither of us said anything. About 20 minutes into our patrol, we spotted him. A man standing in the clearing ahead. He was hunched, his clothes tattered and covered in dirt and moss. His hair was long, unkempt, and his skin looked grayish, like he hadn't seen the sun in years. At first, I thought he was a lost hiker, maybe one who'd been out here far too long. But as we approached, something about him felt wrong. He didn't react to us. He just stood there, staring into the distance, as if he didn't even notice we were there. "Sir?" I called out, keeping my hand on the radio at my belt. "You okay?" Slowly, he turned his head toward us, and I'll never forget the look in his eyes. Hollow, almost lifeless, but with this strange awareness, like he knew something we didn't. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered, his voice rough, like someone who hadn't spoken in years. Dan and I exchanged glances. "Sir, do you need help?" Dan asked, stepping forward. "Have you been out here long?" The man's eyes flickered for a moment, as if trying to remember something. "I've been here since the beginning," he muttered, his words slow, deliberate. "Since they brought me into the earth." My stomach turned. Something about the way he spoke didn't sit right. "What do you mean? Brought you where?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "The forest," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It took us all. Keeps us. The ones who vanished. The ones from before." Dan gave me a look, a mixture of confusion and concern. "We need to get him back to the station," he said under his breath, and I nodded. We moved toward him cautiously, telling him we'd take him somewhere safe, but the man didn't move. "You won't leave," he said, his eyes locking with mine. "No one ever does." As soon as we tried to guide him toward the trail, the forest seemed to change around us. The path we had walked just minutes before was gone. The trees seemed closer, the underbrush thicker, like it had shifted while we weren't looking. Dan grabbed his radio, but all we got was static. Then, through the crackling noise, we heard voices. Faint, distorted, but unmistakable. They were calling for help. Desperate, frantic. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "What the hell is this?" Dan muttered, turning the radio dial frantically. The voices grew louder, overlapping, as if they were coming from all directions. "We need to move." The man hadn't budged. He just stood there, watching us with that same blank expression. "They're still here," he said softly. "The ones who were taken. We never leave." I don't know what came over me, but I had to know more. "What do you mean? Who are you talking about?" His lips trembled as he spoke. "I was part of the search back in '84. We were looking for the missing, but the forest, it doesn't let you go. Consumes. And now, I am one of them." Dan grabbed my arm, his voice urgent. "We need to go. Now." But before we could take a step, the man's face began to change. His skin, already pale and lifeless, began to sag, his eyes sinking into his skull. It was as if decades of decay were catching up with him in a matter of seconds. His body crumbled, turning to dust before our eyes, leaving nothing but the faint smell of earth and moss. We stood there, frozen in horror. "Go!" I yelled, snapping out of the trance. We ran, not knowing where we were going, only that we had to get out. The forest seemed alive around us, shifting, closing in. The trail was gone, replaced by an endless maze of trees that seemed to twist and grow with every step. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I didn't stop. Somehow, after what felt like hours, we stumbled out of the forest and into the clearing where our cruiser was parked. The sky was darker than it should have been, and the air felt thick, almost oppressive. We jumped into the car, breathing hard, and peeled out of there as fast as we could. When we got back to town, something was off. The streets were quieter than usual, and everything felt wrong. We checked the clock in the cruiser, and my heart sank. 2 days had passed. 2 full days. We had entered the forest just before dusk on Monday, and now it was Wednesday. Dan and I filed the report, but no one believed us. They thought we got lost, maybe hit our heads in the confusion. But we know what happened. We know the man we saw was one of the missing people from the 1980s, the ones who vanished in that same forest without a trace. I haven't gone back since, and I never will, but I still hear the whispers, late at night when the wind blows just right. The forest isn't done with us. Not yet, and I know one day it will call me back. Third story, the child in the lake. It was supposed to be a quiet night shift. I had only been on the force for a few months, and in a town as small as ours, most nights were slow. Maybe a noise complaint or a couple of teenagers sneaking into the park after dark. Nothing serious. So when the call came in about a child drowning at the lake, it hit hard. I remember gripping the steering wheel tighter than usual as I drove toward the park. The woman on the phone was hysterical, screaming that she had seen a boy go under, thrashing in the water, and then nothing. No resurfacing, no bubbles, just silence. I got there in minutes, but it felt like hours. When I pulled up, the park was empty except for a woman standing by the water, her hands trembling, her face pale under the dim park lights. She ran toward me as soon as I stepped out of the car, her voice panicked. "He went under. Right there." She pointed toward the lake, her fingers shaking. "I swear, I saw him." I rushed to the edge of the water, scanning the surface, hoping, praying, to see some sign of the boy. But the lake was still, the reflection of the moon rippling slightly in the cool autumn breeze. No sign of a struggle, no cries for help. I waded in, the icy water soaking through my pants, but I couldn't see anything. No splashes, no movement, just the eerie silence of the night. "There's no one here," I said, turning back to the woman. "Maybe you were mistaken? It's dark, and—" "No," she interrupted, her voice firm despite the panic. "I know what I saw. He was there. A little boy, couldn't have been older than 8. He was wearing a red jacket. He went under and then—" Nothing. I wanted to believe her, but after an hour of searching the shoreline and calling for backup, we found nothing. No child, no red jacket, nothing. I had no choice but to file the report as a false alarm. But something about the woman's terror stuck with me. It wasn't just the fear of seeing a child in danger. It was the look in her eyes. It was like she had seen something much worse. The following days didn't offer much comfort. I couldn't stop thinking about that night. Something felt off. Then more calls started coming in. Different people all reporting the same thing. A young boy near the lake, wearing a red jacket, always seen by the water, always disappearing before anyone could reach him. Every time I went to check, I found nothing, but the reports kept coming. The thing that got to me was that all the witnesses described him the same way. Small, with dark hair and a red jacket, around 8 years old. And always, he would vanish beneath the water without a trace. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story, so I started looking into old records. I combed through decades of missing persons cases from the area, and that's when I found it. 30 years ago, a boy named Samuel Porter went missing near the lake. He was last seen wearing a red jacket. His body was never found. The case had gone cold, just another tragedy that time buried. But Samuel wasn't the only one. Over the years, several children had disappeared near the lake, some dating back almost a century. Always young, always around the same age. None of them were ever found. I became obsessed, couldn't let it go. Something was happening at that lake, something no one else could explain. I knew I had to figure it out. I started going to the park every night, watching the water, waiting. And then one night I saw him. It was late, just after midnight. The air was thick with fog rolling off the lake, and I was sitting in my patrol car, watching the rippling water, when I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but then I saw him, a boy standing right at the edge of the water. His red jacket stood out against the dark backdrop of the trees. My heart pounded in my chest. This was it. This was what everyone had seen. I jumped out of the car and sprinted toward him, shouting for him to stop. But before I could reach him, he turned and walked straight into the lake. I ran into the water after him, the freezing cold biting into my skin as I plunged in deeper. I could see him just beneath the surface, moving further into the lake. But he wasn't swimming, he was walking, like the water wasn't affecting him at all. I dove in, my hands reaching out, desperate to grab him, to save him, but he just kept moving deeper, disappearing into the dark water. That's when I saw it. At the bottom of the lake, illuminated by the pale moonlight filtering through the water, was an opening, a small, jagged entrance to what looked like an underwater cave. I felt a pull, something urging me to follow. Against every instinct I had, I swam down. Inside the cave, the water grew still. The walls were rough, covered in thick moss, and the light barely reached the interior. But there, scattered across the rocky floor, were objects. Small toys, shoes, a child's backpack, all coated in a thin layer of silt. These were relics of the missing. I recognized the red jacket, tattered and old, resting near a pile of other belongings. And in that moment, I realized what had happened. The children had been here, taken. I felt a sudden rush of cold, colder than the water around me. I turned to leave, to swim back up, but something stopped me. A reflection. I looked down and saw the boy again. Only this time he wasn't alone. There were others, children, their faces pale and eyes wide with an emptiness that made my blood run cold. And behind them, something darker, a shadowed figure, looming just beyond the edge of my vision. I tried to swim up, to escape, but my limbs felt heavy, like the water was pulling me down. My lungs burned as I struggled, but the surface seemed further and further away. And then, just before everything went black, I saw my own reflection in the water. My face, pale and lifeless, staring back at me. They found my patrol car the next morning, parked near the lake, door wide open. My colleagues searched the area, but they didn't find me. They never will. A few years have passed since then, and every so often, another report comes in. Someone sees a figure in the lake, a man in a police uniform, struggling beneath the water before disappearing into the depths. I'm still down here, waiting. Fourth story, the last call on Highway 19. There's something about the long, empty stretches of desert road that gets under your skin after a while. As a state trooper in Nevada, I'd spent years patrolling Highway 19, a two-lane ribbon of asphalt cutting through the desolate landscape. The kind of place where the heat shimmered off the road during the day and the sky was an endless black void at night. But the thing about Highway 19 was the calls. They started out as rumors among the officers. Motorists would call in saying they'd seen a car stranded on the side of the road, its hazard lights flashing. A typical roadside breakdown, nothing more. But every time we sent someone out to investigate, the car would be gone. Not a trace. No tire marks, no debris, nothing. At first, we all figured it was just bad luck, maybe a few prank calls. But the reports kept coming, and over time, a pattern emerged. It was always the same spot, around mile marker 132, and it always happened on certain nights, usually after midnight. I'll admit, it started to get under my skin, especially after years of hearing the same story. A beat-up old car, lights flashing, sometimes with the driver standing beside it, waving for help. But when the troopers arrived, no one was there. So one night, I decided I was going to figure this out myself. I didn't tell anyone. Didn't want the guys at the station thinking I was chasing ghosts. But I had a gut feeling. I drove out to mile marker 132, parked my cruiser on the shoulder, and waited. The desert was quiet. The only sound the occasional gust of wind kicking up dust. The hours ticked by, and I was starting to think it really was just some kind of hoax. But then, just after 2 a.m., I saw it. A flicker of light in my rearview mirror, dim at first, then brighter. I turned and spotted a car, maybe 100 yards down the road, its hazard lights flashing in the darkness. My pulse quickened. It matched every description from the reports, a boxy, old car, something out of the 1970s. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. Rusted body, peeling paint, and headlights that barely cut through the night. I stepped out of my cruiser, my boots crunching on the gravel shoulder as I approached. I kept my flashlight low, scanning the ground for any signs of movement. But as I got closer, something felt wrong. The air was still, too still, and the closer I got, the more a chill crept up my spine. The car's engine was off, but the hazard lights kept blinking in a slow, eerie rhythm. I peered through the driver's side window, my flashlight beam cutting through the dust and grime. Inside, slumped in the front seat, was a couple. The first thing that hit me was the smell. That sickly sweet stench of decay, like something had been rotting in the sun for days. I gagged, pulling my shirt up over my nose. The couple, man and woman, were dressed in clothes that looked decades out of place. The man's hand was still gripping the steering wheel, his head leaning back against the headrest, mouth slightly open. The woman's head rested on his shoulder, as if she had fallen asleep there long ago. But they weren't asleep. They were dead. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. The bodies looked ancient, like they'd been sitting there for years, skin sunken and gray, eyes long gone. But that didn't make sense. The car wasn't there 5 minutes ago. Couldn't have been. I grabbed my radio, my hand shaking as I fumbled for the button. "Dispatch, this is Richards, I need..." Before I could finish, a crackling noise came from the car's radio. I froze. The old-fashioned radio, the kind with dials and a needle that moved across stations, came to life, hissing with static. Then, through the static, a voice, faint, barely audible, broke through. "Help us, please." I stood there, frozen in place, my mind spinning. The voice was weak, distant, like it was coming from far away. It repeated again, this time a little clearer, but still distorted. "Help us." My blood turned to ice. I backed away from the car, but before I could move further, the entire vehicle began to fade. Slowly, like smoke being blown away by the wind, the car, the bodies, the flashing lights, all of it just disappeared. One moment it was there, the next the road was empty. Nothing but the faint echo of the voice on the wind. I don't remember getting back into my cruiser, but somehow I did. I drove straight back to the station, my hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles were white. I didn't report it, didn't tell a soul. What was I supposed to say? That I'd seen a ghost? That a car from another time had appeared and vanished right before my eyes? I tried to shake it off, convince myself that I was overtired, that maybe I'd hallucinated the whole thing. But deep down, I knew better. A few days later, I put in for a transfer. I couldn't stay on Highway 19, not after that. But before I left, I had one last patrol to do. It was a quiet night, nothing unusual. I kept my focus straight ahead, trying not to think about mile marker 132, trying not to look in my rearview mirror. But as I neared the turnoff, I saw it. The same old car moving slowly down the highway. It passed me in the opposite direction, its hazard lights still blinking, a faint glow in the pre-dawn darkness. I didn't stop. I didn't look. I just kept driving, my heart pounding, my hands shaking on the wheel. I knew then that Highway 19 wasn't finished with me. It wouldn't matter how far I went, how many miles I put between myself and that desert road. The car, the voices, it would always be there, always waiting. And now, every time I drive at night, no matter where I am, I check my rearview mirror. Because I know sooner or later those flashing lights will be there again, calling for help, calling for me. Fifth story, the silence in the suburban neighborhood. I've been a police officer in our quiet suburban neighborhood in Illinois for almost 10 years, and nothing ever really happens around here. The kind of place where people leave their doors unlocked and the biggest crime is a teenager sneaking out after curfew. That's why the reports about the house at 314 caught my attention. It had been empty for months, yet the calls kept coming in. It started with a few noise complaints. Neighbors said they heard strange sounds, furniture being dragged, muffled voices, coming from the house, even though no one lived there. At first, my colleagues chalked it up to wind or maybe animals finding their way in. But the complaints didn't stop. Almost every week, someone from the block would call about strange noises at night. The other officers brushed it off as paranoia. They didn't want to waste time on a spooky house in a sleepy neighborhood. But for me, it was personal. I lived just down the street from 314. I knew the house well. I had seen it sitting empty, day after day, with no sign of life. Felt wrong. So one night, during a heavy rainstorm, I decided to check it out myself. After all, if there really was something happening there, it was practically in my backyard. I remember the rain hammering down as I approached the house. The front yard was overgrown, weeds choking the flower beds that once had been neatly trimmed. The house itself looked worn, neglected, like a place time had forgotten. The lights of the nearby homes cast long shadows on the wet pavement, and despite the rain, everything seemed too quiet. I walked up to the front door, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The door was unlocked, just like I expected. After all, no one was supposed to be living there. But as soon as I stepped inside, something felt off. The air was thick, almost heavy, and the smell of dust and damp would hit me immediately. My boots echoed on the hardwood floor as I walked through the living room. It was empty, just like I'd seen from the outside. No furniture, no sign of life. But then I saw it, the marks on the floor. Long scratches ran across the wooden planks, like something heavy had been dragged through the room. They were fresh, the kind of marks that furniture would leave if it had been moved recently. But there was no furniture here. I felt a chill run down my spine. I heard it then, a faint, muffled noise, like voices coming from somewhere upstairs. I should have turned back. I should have called for backup. But something in me pushed forward. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was pride, or maybe it was the rain that made everything feel like a dream. I walked toward the staircase, my heartbeat quickening with each step. The noise got louder as I climbed the stairs. It was rhythmic, like something repeating over and over again. Low, indistinct murmurs, the kind that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand on end. The second floor was as empty as the first. The walls were bare, and the rooms had no sign of life. But the noise was clearer now. It was coming from the attic. I found the narrow staircase leading up, half hidden behind a door at the end of the hall. The wooden steps creaked under my weight as I ascended, the sound of the voices growing louder with every step. They weren't just whispers anymore. I could hear anger, fear, pain. When I reached the top, I saw it. In the middle of the empty attic, there was an old, dusty tape recorder. It was running, the tape inside spinning slowly, playing the sounds I had been hearing all night. Voices raised in terror, the unmistakable sound of struggle, of violence. My hands trembled as I approached it. I didn't understand. Why was this here? Why would anyone leave this? I reached down and turned the recorder off. For a moment, everything went silent. Just the rain pattering against the roof and my own ragged breathing. But then, something changed. The air shifted, thickening with a palpable weight. The dim light from my flashlight flickered, and I felt it. The oppressive sense that I wasn't alone. I turned to leave, but the attic didn't look the same anymore. The walls, once bare and abandoned, were now filled with old, faded photographs and furniture covered in dust. It was as if the house had come alive around me. And the voices, they didn't stop. In fact, they grew louder. But now, they weren't coming from the recorder. They were all around me, closing in. I heard screams, the sound of glass shattering, heavy footsteps pounding against the floor. My heart raced as I realized I was hearing the final moments of someone's life. A life that had been violently taken in this very house. I stumbled toward the attic stairs, desperate to get out. But as I reached the bottom, I realized something horrifying. The house, it wasn't letting me leave. The front door, once ajar, was now sealed shut. The once empty rooms were now fully furnished, but they were wrong, stuck in another time. The furniture was old, covered in a thin layer of grime, and the smell of something rotten filled the air. I could hear the voices all around me now, overlapping with each other. Pleas for help, the cries of someone being attacked, and then silence. I ran for the front door, my heart pounding in my chest. I reached for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Desperate, I banged on the door, screaming for help, but no one came. The house seemed to pulse with a life of its own, trapping me in its walls. And then I saw it. A shadow standing at the far end of the hallway. It wasn't human. It was tall, distorted, its shape shifting with the flickering light. I couldn't make out its face, but I knew it was watching me. I don't remember how long I stood there, paralyzed by fear, but when I finally managed to force the door open and stagger out into the rain, I felt a rush of cold air hit me like a slap. But it wasn't over. As I stumbled onto the porch, drenched from the rain, I realized something terrible. I wasn't outside. The street, the other houses, they were gone. In their place was the scene of the crime, frozen in time. The house looked as it had years ago before the murders. The voices were louder now, so loud I couldn't think, couldn't breathe. The figure in the hallway was gone, but I knew it was still there, watching, waiting. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I was trapped, just like the victims of that terrible night. And I knew deep down that I wouldn't be leaving 314. Not ever.